All right, well, want to welcome everyone to the Department of Political Science at UW's Election 2020 series called A Turning Point ? We think the answer is yes, but the question mark is still there to draw interest. And this is going to be a three-part series. Tonight, hot topics, climate change and China relations. On October 14th, will your vote matter? And on October 29th, impacts for our democracy, for executive power, and for the courts, especially the Supreme Court. All three sessions at 6 o'clock. We are viewing this as a partnership with the Washington Institute for the Study of Inequality and Race, or WISER. They have two events, one of which is clearly election-centered, and the other is partially election-centered. So their events are on October 7th, social movements and racial justice. This can be at 11 a.m. and on November 6th, race in the 2020 election. So that'll be a post-election event, a roundtable discussion, also at 11 a.m. So between these three events that the Political Science Department, the two that WISER is doing, we're covering a variety of topics relating to the election, while recognizing that there's a lot of things that we can't cover just depending upon our faculty interests and how we structured this when we designed it a couple of months ago. So for each of these sessions, we're going to try to keep it to the topics that the speakers are going to address. And so there's going to be an opportunity for you all to ask questions. So the first half hour or so will be a 15-minute presentation by each speaker, who I'll introduce here shortly. And then after that, we'll take your questions. So you can probably see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address as many of those as we can. So my name is Mark Allen Smith. I think I forgot to mention at the outset, but I'm going to be serving as the moderator. I'll also field the questions. And then my first role here is to introduce the speakers. So we have Professor Aseem Prakash and Professor Susan Whiting. So I'll give a longer introduction for Professor Prakash here, and then before Professor Whiting speaks, I'll give a more full introduction for her. So for Professor Prakash, he is the Walker Family Professor for the College of Arts and Sciences, and he's the founding director of the Center for Environmental Politics. And Professor Prakash's research focuses on environmental policy, climate governance, non-governmental organizations and nonprofits, and voluntary and private regulation. He's a very well-known scholar who has been cited 12,000 times in his scholarly works. And he also writes for broader audiences through many channels, including most recently regular articles for Forbes magazine. And Professor Prakash has also received many awards, including from the International Studies Association, the European Consortium for Political Research, Public Administration Review, and the American Political Science Association. Professor Prakash has also received teaching awards and commendations here at UW, and also from George Washington University and Indiana University. And it brings me great pleasure to present to you Professor Aseem Prakash.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for a great introduction. Thanks to everybody for making the time to join us today. I'll be sharing some thoughts on how the 2020 elections and climate issues are connected, if they are at all. And I'll be drawing on the commentaries that Nevis Dolchak and I have written in Forbes, in Conversation, Washington Post, and some other outlets. So should climate issues be important for 2020 elections? And there are a lot of reasons why they should be important. So let me briefly go through them. If you look at opinion polls, over the years, there is an increasingly support for prioritizing climate issues. So when Pew asked the question, should XXX be the top priority for the president and Congress, 2020 is the first year when more than 50% of Americans said yes. So based on opinion polls, it seems climate issues have a lot of political traction. Alongside, now a majority of Americans, almost 2/3, actually slightly more than 2/3, believe that the federal government is not doing enough to protect the climate and environment. So not only people think that the federal government and the president should prioritize climate change, they also think not enough is being done. So there is a political demand, there's an unsatisfied demand for political action on climate change. And since a lot of politics is local, a lot of people believe or say, at least 62%, that they have been directly affected or their community has seen some effects of climate change. So climate change is not something foreign, something out there, but climate change is something that affects them on a day-to-day basis. And of course, we have these events, these shocks, such as the ongoing wildfires in California, which of course spread to Oregon and state of Washington. In fact, even today, there is a smog. The fires in Northern California are polluting air in the city of Seattle. So all these are reminders of the climate crisis. This is not to say that the fires are only because of climate change. Governance failures have very important roles to play, but climate change is multiplying the threats. It's a threat multiplier, whether it's hurricanes, whether it's floods, or whether it's wildfires. And we can't run away from it. It's affecting our day-to-day life. In the last 2 years, there is also a very popular movement, for lack of a better word, called the Green New Deal. The Sunrise Coalition, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others have put climate change on the agenda. And that's why the Democratic presidential primaries, climate change, the Green New Deal were actively debated. And whether one likes the Green New Deal or one hates it, it is a defining issue of our times. Which means that the political salience again of climate issues has increased substantially, because now there is a new vocabulary to talk about climate change and what kind of climate policies should be brought to fruition so that we can address the massive climate challenge. And the corporate sector has jumped in, whether it's Microsoft, Amazon, which are racing to become the climate leaders, whether it's Unilever in the consumer goods sectors, or whether it's banks. So that's Larry Fink of BlackRock, which are actively declaring that they are going to be climate advocates. They're going to be climate leaders. They're taking zero emission pledges, etc., etc. And of course, the shouting match you saw 2 days ago, it also mentioned climate change. Last time climate change was mentioned in presidential debates was 2008, when Barack Obama debated John McCain. In fact, even in the vice presidential debate, Sarah Palin declared that she believes that there is climate change. But after that, climate change has been off the presidential agenda, at least when it comes to debates. And it was resurrected unexpectedly in the first debate, although it was not in the list of the 6 topics that Chris Wallace was supposed to talk about, but he brought it up. And this was one of the few issues where both the candidates actually spoke something of substance, and their policy approaches and the divergence between the approaches was visible. Now, let's come to the less exciting and less encouraging stories. That so far, it seems that climate change is on top of the pops. It should be dominating the election cycle, and everybody should be talking about climate change. It has the political vocabulary, the corporate sector is gung-ho about it, and it seems through opinion polls that Americans want a quick and decisive action on climate change. But when we look at opinion polls where climate change is thrown in with other issues, it falls in salience. The 2016 elections, if you look at the exit polls, 52% said the most important issue facing the country is economy. And economy, immigration, foreign policy, and terrorism. These were the 4 top issues for both Democrats and Republicans. The salience slightly varied, but economy was the most important issue. by far. The same story continued in 2018 midterm elections, where healthcare became the most important issue, followed by the immigration and economy and gun policy. And climate change again did not figure in the top 4 issues that motivated or that influenced the vote in 2018 midterm elections. If you look at polls conducted in late July, early August of this year by Pew, which is the top issue for voters, they listed a large number of issues, and climate change, if you see, is at almost the bottom. Economy is top, followed by healthcare, Supreme Court appointment, and climate change is not being prioritized as the most important issue. So this is depressing. That climate change, when it is standalone, it seems to be having political salience. But when climate change is put together with the economy, with gun control, Supreme Court, healthcare, it loses salience. So do climate issues don't matter at all? Or under what conditions, in what circumstances might climate issues matter in 2020 elections? Interestingly, President Trump suggests that he is actually Ted Roosevelt too, because he claims to be an avid environmentalist. And of course, under his administration, a very large number of environmental laws have been rolled back. But there have been 2 recent initiatives where Senate Republicans have taken the initiative and staked out leadership position in environmental protection. The first is the Great American Outdoors Act, which essentially created a $20 billion trust fund to for the national parks and other protected lands for their upkeep. And 2 senators in particular have taken leadership positions, Senator Cory Gardner of Colorado and Senator Daines of Montana. Both are embattled Republicans, and both have terrible scores when it comes to environmental issues. So if you look at League of Conservation Voters, which ranks the annual legislative performance, these 2 senators don't perform well. But come competitive elections, they have suddenly become environmentalists. And what is the reason? The reason is that both in Montana and Colorado, there are a substantial number of environmental voters who would reward and punish politicians based on their environmental positions. And these are very competitive races. So both these senators are sticking out environmental leadership. They're actively being supported by Senator Mitch McConnell and President Trump. The similar story played out in the South on the Atlantic coast, where in the last 10 days, President Trump has declared that the Atlantic coasts will not be allowed for offshore drilling. Initially, he started with Florida in 2018, which is the classic swing state. And then he included South Carolina and Georgia, both states where the Senate elections are going to be competitive. Then after a few days, he added North Carolina, which again is facing a competitive Senate elections. And yesterday he added Virginia. So all these states have one thing in common: they have competitive elections. And it seems that there is a sufficient number of environmental voters or climate concerns are important in these states that these senators and the president are taking leadership position. And what they're saying is that we are not going to permit offshore drilling. They're not giving it a climate spin. They are not saying because of climate reasons. They're saying for beauty and aesthetics, because these states have a long shoreline and have a sizable tourism industry where the oil rigs probably are not the most helpful. But it's not that only the Republicans are doing the double talk. Democrats are not far behind. So if you think of Vice President Biden, he's quite focused on winning Pennsylvania and being competitive in Ohio. And both the states have a sizable number of fracking jobs, especially Pennsylvania. So in spite of being very pro-climate, being committed to a very aggressive decarbonization plan, Vice President Biden is very clear that he's not going to be banning fracking. The only area where he'll ban fracking is on federal lands, but 70% of fracking anyway takes place on private land. So he's also trying to appeal to local voters, to local economy, but in an, I would say, anti-climate stand, although he's by far the better candidate when it comes to environmental protection. So what are the lessons? The lessons are that first, politicians pay attention to environmental issues in competitive elections. So if the elections are not competitive, the importance, the leverage of the environmental voter is reduced. And second, it's not the global environmental issues. It's the local benefits of environmental protection, not save the earth rhetoric, that are leading the charge. So whether it's jobs related to outdoors in Montana and Colorado, lifestyle choices, or whether it's tourism related economic benefits in the Atlantic coast that these senators and the president are trying to emphasize, or fracking jobs in the case of Vice President Biden. So what should a climate voter do? There are two things a climate voter can do. First is vote with your dollars, but in races that are competitive. Donating to candidates in non-competitive races because of their environmental stance might make you feel good, but it's not very politically wise. So if you really want to make a change, identify competitive races and then support the candidates who are outspoken in support for environmental issues. And if you are really brave and you want to vote with your feet, you want to relocate, then go to a purple state. I know Seattle is lovely, it's beautiful, I love living here, but my vote is quite useless. So go to a state where your vote actually matters. So this is the two-way an environmental voter in the future races can make his or her voice heard. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Professor Prakash. And I want to remind everyone that if you have questions or topics that you want Professor Prakash to address, please type them into the Q&A box, which should be near the bottom of your screen, and we will. I'll toss those to him when we finish up here. I do want to note that your question should be in the form of a question rather than a statement, so that we can have something for him to respond to. So I'll now introduce Professor Susan Whiting. She holds her primary appointment in political science and has adjunct appointments at UW in the Jackson School of International Studies and the School of Law. She teaches and researches in the areas of comparative politics and Chinese politics, especially on issues regarding authoritarianism, the rule of law, property rights, fiscal reform, and rural development. She's held many grants and fellowships, including from the UW Global Innovation Fund, the Ching Kyo Foundation, U.S. Department of Education, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, the East Asia Institute in Seoul, South Korea, the American Council of Learned Societies, and Hopkins Nanjing Institute for International Research. And she's currently finishing a book manuscript on property rights over land in China. So it brings me great pleasure to bring to you Professor Susan Whiting.
Thank you, Mark. And I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Does that look good, Mark? All right, I'm assuming everyone can see.
I can see it. I was muted there.
Great, yeah, just checking. Thank you. All right, thanks for that introduction. And I'm really happy to be here on a panel with my colleagues. So the question that I'm thinking about is US-China relations and election 2020. Is this a turning point, and what's at stake? I think, in fact, a lot is at stake in the relationship between the world's two largest economies and major powers. I have time today to point to 4 areas. If perhaps there'll be questions about a fifth: international security, trade and economy, climate cooperation, building on Aseem's comments, and human rights. Certainly there are many more issues, for example, people-to-people relations. So I want to turn first to international security. And in terms of international security, I'll highlight two potential flashpoints. For those who remember 20 years ago, the election campaign between Bush and Gore in 2000, the Taiwan Straits was considered a major potential flashpoint. That was completely eclipsed by the 9/11 attacks, but it is once again today a major potential flashpoint. At issue is the long-term US policy of strategic ambiguity. So let me give you a little bit of background on this strategic ambiguity, and then I'll comment on what I think each candidate, how they will engage with this issue. For background, China considers Taiwan to be part of its territory, and the US recognizes the People's Republic of China as the government of one China, while Taiwan has developed a separate functioning and vibrant democracy, and the US has committed to the defense of Taiwan and the maintenance of the status quo in the Taiwan Straits. The idea of strategic ambiguity is twofold. One, to deter China from threatening Taiwan, and second, to do so without emboldening Taiwan to antagonize China. Okay, let me turn to the Trump administration's engagement on this issue. Voices in the Trump White House and certainly in Congress call for explicit US support for Taiwan, for ending that kind of strategic ambiguity and really making an explicit commitment to Taiwan. But that carries great risk of violent conflict. Just in the past weeks and months under the Trump administration, there have been recent visits by Cabinet Secretary Azar and an Undersecretary of State to Taiwan. The Cabinet Secretary was the highest ranking US official to visit Taiwan since 1979. That elicited an unprecedented show of force in the Taiwan Straits in recent weeks by China, with maneuvers by dozens of combat aircraft, bombers, fighters, among others. This highlights the risks to peace and security, and it's striking that it hasn't been as prominent in the news as one might expect. President Trump, for his part, personally puts much more emphasis on trade and the economy. So there are different kind of voices within the Trump White House. And as of today, his administration has not abandoned strategic ambiguity. So not taking sides and clearly throwing its weight behind Taiwan or China. In a future Biden administration, while Biden would face similar pressures to reevaluate current policy, including from Congress, I anticipate that strategic ambiguity is likely to continue under a Biden administration. The second potential flashpoint that I'll flag is the South China Sea. And at issue is international law, freedom of navigation through major international shipping lanes, and competing territorial claims between China and Southeast Asian nations. China has militarized islands in the South China Sea and has asserted claims to a broad area of the South China Sea, while an international tribunal in The Hague has ruled China's claims invalid. China rejects this ruling. Turning to the two potential future administrations, Trump's response has been to step up freedom of navigation operations by the US military. These took place under the Obama administration, but Obama was criticized for not being as assertive, and Trump has stepped this up. But he also dispositionally doesn't seek multilateral action with allies. Biden is again likely to continue the Trump policy of increased freedom of navigation operations, but he sees a much greater role for allies and partners. What I think is striking at this time is a new emerging bipartisan consensus. Both parties, Republicans and Democrats, believe that a stronger policy is needed vis-a-vis China. And in a break from previous administrations, both Republican and Democratic, neither party believes that integrating China into the global political economy will make it a supporter of the liberal international order. So this is a high tension area. That said, neither party has a concrete plan for peaceful resolution of this potential flashpoint. And in fact, we see that the Trump administration has actually led on a major reset of attitudes in China. We see that towards China by Americans. And we can see that since the beginning of the Trump administration, negative attitudes towards China, and this is reflecting a Pew Research poll that's been taken every year since 2005, most recently in March of this year. Negative attitudes toward China have increased 20 percentage points since the beginning of the Trump administration. And in fact, about 62% of Americans see China now as a threat. That's about a 20% increase as well. These, I think, negative attitudes towards China are likely to continue, and even in a future Biden administration. So I think what we've seen is a major reset in popular attitudes towards China, shifting negatively under the Trump administration. And I think that that's reflected in Congress as well. I think we begin when we turn to trade and economy, we see much greater differences between the two future administrations. President Trump has made bilateral trade deficits a major issue. Now, economists tend not to focus on bilateral trade deficits since the global economy is highly integrated. And if you take a look at this data, if we just do look at bilateral US-China trade deficits, you can see that under the Trump administration, the US-China trade deficit in the longest red bar ballooned to an all-time high in 2018 of about 420 billion US dollars. In 2019, in the context of the trade war, the deficit returned to levels seen in the Obama administration, and we see a kind of decline in both US exports to China and US imports from China. In the context of this trade war, US exports to China declined by about $25 billion. US firms face retaliatory tariffs and more restrictions on technology trade and that sort of thing. And so US exports to China last year actually declined. Okay, so Trump has made the bilateral trade deficit a major issue, and his answer is decoupling. So this is the idea of separating the US and Chinese economies. And we'll see that Trump's tool is tariffs and trade war. Biden, here we see a much different view. Biden's view is that full decoupling is actually impossible. And this is because of the deep global integration of manufacturing. And you can see that just in the example in the context of the pandemic of PPE, of personal protective equipment. The US continued to import PPE from China because in part it's difficult for US firms to start up quickly. And US firms hesitate to invest if they think demand is temporary and they're not going to have a long-term payoff for their investment. So that's just one example of how decoupling is very difficult, specifically in the context of the pandemic. The decoupling, we can see another example of why decoupling is unlikely if we look at just the US auto industry, a kind of iconic industry for the US. When we think about autos, China now has the largest market in the world for automobiles. And that's a market that's growing with a growing middle class. So there's lots of demand for automobiles in China. US corporations want to be there. For example, General Motors has built state-of-the-art manufacturing and R&D facilities in China. And in fact, right through the trade war, General Motors has imported complete cars like the Buick Envision from China to the US market, this despite tariffs. Tesla also wants to be in China, right? And has made major investments in manufacturing and R&D there. So part of the challenge of decoupling is not only the integration of global supply chains, but the strategies of US corporations and their desire to be located near major sources of demand. So here we see a more stark difference. Continuing with trade and economy, both Trump and Biden have made a major issue of the loss of manufacturing jobs and unfair trade. Trump famously blames bad trade agreements that allow unfair trade to continue. And one of the early steps in his administration was withdrawing the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. And his answer has been America first, acting unilaterally, and tariffs in the context of the trade war with China and with other trading partners. Biden takes a kind of different tact. He blames US corporations in part, and he proposes to use tax policy to shift their behavior. First, he would reverse elements of Trump's 2017 corporate tax cuts. He would increase taxes on foreign earnings of US corporations. So for example, GM remits some profits from its operations in China to its headquarters in the US. That would face increased taxation under a Biden administration. And on the flip side, he is proposing significant tax credits for companies that create jobs in the US. And he also has a plan for investing in infrastructure and research and development around advanced technologies. On trade agreements, again, we see a contrast. A Biden administration could potentially rejoin what survives of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's now known as the Comprehensive and Progressive TPP. And it involves 11 countries in Asia and embodies higher regulatory standards. So the US could kind of rejoin that in a multilateral approach. That's much more likely under a Biden administration. Either way, manufacturing is unlikely to return at scale to the US. That's in part a reflection of automation, which makes manufacturing much more capital intensive than labor intensive. And it's also partly because globalization is hard to reverse, as I've just suggested through a couple examples. So in the time I have, let me quickly turn to climate and then briefly on human rights. On climate change, Trump has, of course, claimed famously that climate change is a hoax, and he has kind of abandoned US leadership by exiting the Paris Climate Agreement. By contrast, Biden takes climate change seriously and is likely to, much more likely to adapt a multilateral approach. So some of these agreements, multilateral agreements, could be revisited under a Biden administration. There's also potential for a much more balanced relationship with China instead of all of government kind of pushback on China. That might create the potential for climate change cooperation, even as tensions exist in international security and in trade. So I think under a Biden administration, there could be progress on climate cooperation at the same time as these other tensions exist. And just last week, we can see Chinese President Xi Jinping really trying to assert symbolic leadership in the climate area. And in a speech to the UN last week, President Xi announced that China will be carbon neutral by 2060. Now, this may be much more rhetorical than real, right? But rhetorically, what he's trying to do is position China, not the US, as a leader on climate change. And this rhetorical goal is going to be very challenging to achieve because China continues to add, for example, coal-fired power generation capacity right now in 2020. So making those targets and being carbon neutral by 2060 will be a great challenge, but it's really a symbolic kind of statement. And very briefly on human rights, at issue are religious freedom, freedom of expression, the fate of the Uyghurs, and Hong Kong. I don't think in any administration that human rights are the absolute top priority in foreign policy. So that's true, I think, of every administration. However, Trump's style is much more transactional. That makes it much more erratic. And in contrast, with Biden, I think we will see that human rights are likely to be part of a more balanced, more coherent, and multilateral relationship with China. So I think we'll see potentially very different style in a Biden administration, bringing human rights consistently on the agenda, although not at the top of the agenda. So I've touched on a number of issues, and we can see that trade and economy are where I think these candidates differ the most, but no matter what issue we look at, a lot is at stake in this election. And I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Professor Whiting. And at this point, we're going to welcome some questions from the audience. So I'll remind you all that there is the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and some of you already thrown in questions, although more for Professor Prakash, probably because he was up first. So if you have any questions for Professor Whiting on U.S.-China relations in relation to the election, dealing with the trade, the economy, the security, and the other matters that she touched on, go ahead and drop those in, and I'll get to as many of them as I can. So let me start with one that was intended for Professor Prakash. So one person mentioned that if you wanted to try to build a coalition toward climate change policies, since a lot of districts or states aren't necessarily competitive between the parties, maybe you do have some competition within a Democratic primary. So would it be a savvy political move for climate concerned Democrats to field candidates against Democratic incumbents to get more pro-climate change challengers to take on those Democrats in party primaries?
Thank you, Mark. That's an excellent question. And that's exactly the policy AOC and the Sunrise Movement have been trying to implement since 2018, that the incumbent or the traditional Democrat is challenged on different things, but including climate policy. And this moves the whole climate debate more towards the left. It becomes more aggressive on climate change, with the hope that if this individual gets elected, then eventually the outcome would be a bit more pro-climate. This policy has pros and cons. The advantage is that there is an increased pressure, at least in the House where Democrats have a majority, to take a more aggressive action on the climate front. So this is positive, that Democrats simply cannot take the environmental constituency for granted. But the negative is that what is the median voter for Democrats may not be the median voter for the country. What do I mean by that? If Democrats move too much on the left on climate, they will lose out on the median voter in the country. And perhaps the best example is fracking. I would suggest that the median Democrat would be okay with banning fracking, or would not react very violently if there is a proposal to ban fracking, both on private and public land. But the voter in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and other states where there are thousands of fracking jobs will not probably agree. So if Vice President Biden was pushed too much to take an anti-fracking stand, then his position in Pennsylvania and Ohio, both are very important swing states, would get weakened. So the message for pro-climate Democrats, Sunrise Movement, the Green New Dealers, is that apply pressure, but apply pressure strategically. Don't apply pressure in a way that your candidate becomes less competitive in the elections, because the elections do matter. And you'd rather have a candidate who doesn't take a very radical position, gets elected, and does not take very radical steps on the climate front, as opposed to a candidate who's hostile to climate issues. So it's important to think of the big picture when it comes to climate issues and the extent to which a Democratic or a liberal voter needs to push their representatives on the climate front.
Great, thanks, Professor Prakash, for that response. So let me throw a question to Professor Whiting. A person was curious about the TikTok controversy, which has been in the news a lot in recent weeks. Is this something that voters are aware of? Would it make any difference for the election, given the age distribution of the people who use TikTok? What are the long-term security issues that are in play here, and so on?
Yeah, well, this may not be a top election issue precisely as you suggest, because TikTok users trend young, and young voters out there, if you care about this issue, you can weigh in by actually voting in greater numbers this year. So I think one concern is that what China has developed is kind of an intranet where inside the so-called Great Firewall, the Chinese government has a lot of control over the technology, the content of expression in social media. I don't think we want to go outside of China in that direction. So there's some challenges in governing cybersecurity while still having integrated global communications. So the challenge that the Trump administration has posed to TikTok has been paused in the courts for now. The courts have seen that their claims may have some merit. So I think that the courts may kind of take that kind of view that business is going to operate as in multiple contexts. But a good way to weigh in from young TikTok users' perspective for eligible voters is to get out there and vote.
A great message, even independent of any TikTok controversy. So thanks for that response. I'm going to toss this next question to Professor Prakash. So you mentioned that Americans tend to express a lot of concern about the environment in general and climate change in particular. But then when you compare it to other issues, for example, in the exit polls, its salience drops quite a bit and it ranks pretty low in terms of priority. Does that same finding hold in other countries? Does it hold in European countries? Would it hold, say, in Australia or other Anglo-American type countries where we might have a similar culture? Or is this really a distinctively American phenomenon where people don't seem to be able to prioritize the issue, even though they care about it at some level?
I think that's a very interesting question. There are at least two things to keep in mind. One, in most European countries, there is a reasonable consensus on environmental issues. So even in Britain, the Tories are not hostile to climate the way some of the Republicans are hostile to climate issues. So there is a fair level of convergence in Europe on climate issues. Of course, there are some areas of divergence and the extent to which a particular country should aggressively pursue climate goals. But we don't see that kind of climate polarization in Europe the way we see in the United States of America. That is one. Second, the systems of elections are quite different. So parliamentary system versus the presidential system and proportional representation versus first past the post means that different voting systems are giving different power, different leverage to the environmental constituency, to the climate constituency. Green parties have not done very well in Europe after 1980s. In 1980s, they were important players, and then they declined in importance. And one of the reasons was that the mainstream parties co-opted their agendas. But the fact of the matter is that in Europe, issues of economy, of immigration are certainly very important. And these are the issues where there is a sharp division. The voter can differentiate between different parties. But when it comes to the issue of climate, there's a fair level of convergence. So we don't see this kind of noise, this kind of raucousness, this kind of polarization in Europe as we see in the United States.
Yeah, that's a really interesting contrast there. So thanks for highlighting that for us. So question for Professor Whiting. Let's suppose a new president was elected. That would be a President Biden in this case. He pulls you into the Oval Office after the election, says, all right, the campaign's over. We really need advice from somebody who knows what they're talking about here. What do I need to know about China that is really different from what's reported in the mass media that we wouldn't get if we didn't have a real China expert in the room, which is you. So what's your response to a hypothetical President Biden?
What we don't know about China that
or what's different than like the popular perception that someone might get if they were just, say, a New York Times reader. What would a China expert have that really isn't being talked about in the media?
Well, one of the puzzles, if you think about China as a single party regime, is that what appears to be high degrees of trust in government in China. And I think that might be in part a reflection of the infrastructural power that China has developed, reaching into communities right down to the village, and developing policies over the past 40 years, step by step, to increase support for welfare, for example, after a kind of Wild West style transition to capitalism, when lots of people fell through a very thin social safety net. So I think that might be surprising from the outside, looking at a single party regime that also has many repressive characteristics. Also, internet users in China typically don't think about censorship all the time and are not always aware of censorship. So yeah, so the perspective from inside of China and from outside might be quite different. If I may, I should say, when I answered the TikTok question, I was really had kind of WeChat on the brain, thinking about that as a kind of connection between communities all around the world and China. And so I should say about ByteDance and TikTok, although the Microsoft bid was denied, there's in the offing this possible sale of stakes to Walmart and Oracle, who will be minority owners. So that might be a solution to the TikTok issue outside of the courts. So, so I think both WeChat and TikTok as major global platforms coming from China are on the agenda.
All right, excellent. Appreciate that answer. So, of course, the wildfires have been in the news throughout the West, including here. And in fact, they're still tonight. There's not as much smoke at like the ground level, but higher up in the atmosphere there is. And so tonight, if you want to see a full moon that is lit up orange because of the haze, supposedly that'll. And so a person here is curious about attribution of responsibility for this. So Professor Prakash, you mentioned in your presentation that, in fact, there have been governance failures, by which I presume you mean the failure to clear out underbrush and to always stamp out the smaller fires, really for the last 100 years. So people, this isn't exactly a new thing, but then you said climate change is a magnifier on top of that. So really, I think I hear you attributing responsibility to both poor governance and the climate change. But this person's question, if you listen to the discourse on the left, it's basically, let's push the governance problems just off the map entirely and only talk about climate change. And this person's curious, does this kind of undermine the credibility of people on the left to attribute it all to climate change and to try to pretend that the governance failures aren't there?
This is a very important point. The climate change is happening, it's real, it's severe. And all of us have to act ASAP. So there is no doubt about that. But the reality is that there are several factors that are accentuating, making us less resilient to all these changes. So blaming everything on climate change is unhelpful for two reasons. First, it's incorrect. And second, it is kind of allowing our leaders, whether it's left or the right, to go scot-free. So let me give you a few examples. So Mark, you've already mentioned about lack of active forest management policies. And there are reasons why environmental groups have opposed it. So if a forest has been burnt and you want to clear it, you have to go through a National Environmental Protection Act, the NEPA process, and it takes time. And that's because businesses have allegedly exploited the loophole. So there is a distrust. I think we are not in the stage, or we should not be spending time pointing fingers that who's to be blamed. There is a level of distrust between environmental groups and the forest management or the timber companies. But eventually what this leads to is that there is too much of fuel. And on top of that, now we have communities that are living what is called the interface between the wilderness and urbanization, which means you can't have controlled fires because they might spill into neighborhoods. It might create health problems, etc. Plus, in places like California, they were not allowing the fire risks to be reflected in insurance rates. So there is a moral hazard problem where people continue to build property, their houses, their place of dwellings, deep inside the forest without fully accounting for the risks. Same thing is happening on the Atlantic seaboard, where you have hurricanes, the houses get destroyed, but somehow the FEMA and National Flood Protection Insurance Fund bails them out. And there is a lot of research that shows that a few number of houses are getting repeatedly flooded and repeatedly getting bailed out. So we have serious public policy problems. And public policy problems in the sense we are not creating appropriate incentives for people to take precautionary measures to adapt to the climate challenge. People are building houses in floodplains, and then we as taxpayers bail them out. So I hope the issue's not about left or right, though it's framed that way. I think that's a correct observation. The idea is, how do we make a more resilient society? Because all these floods and fires, they are imposing disproportionate impact on poor people who don't have the resources to, just pack up and leave, and they typically don't have the resources to rebuild. And everybody will have to make concessions. Everybody will have to arrive, or at least make a good faith effort to arrive at a compromise, so that we can all pool in our resources, our talents, and have a commonsensical, rational solution to improve our climate resilience. And unfortunately, the political parties are both parties are to be blamed, are more interested in polarizing the issue than actually trying to solve the problem. So my hope is that next administration, whether it's Trump or it's Biden, would at least make an effort. Some efforts are being made in the Senate. There is a bill co-sponsored by Republican and Democrat senators, including Senator Feinstein, about management of forests. So it's not that there is no action, there is no movement. There is a lot of movement, but this movement has to be very massive, because the scale of the problem is very massive. This is just, early October, the first day of October, and we're still having these fires, and the fire season would continue for at least one more month in California. And we simply cannot afford to have reoccurrence of fires on this scale year after year. There are huge costs that all of us have to pick up.
Yeah, we're still seeing those. So this is a question for Professor Whiting in relation to religious freedom and religious repression in China. We've, of course, heard a lot about the treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and over a longer period, Buddhists in Tibet, and questions relating to what to do about the retraining, quote, retraining facilities in those two provinces, as well as the what some people have called the cultural genocide in relation to the Uyghurs, and other related controversies, like with the recent Mulan film, the Disney film that thanked some of the governmental entities in Xinjiang and did not go over so well in world perception. So what can the U.S. do about violations of religious freedom in China? And is this a campaign issue? How does this issue get on the agenda?
Well, I hasn't. It remains to be seen if it's a campaign issue between Trump and Biden. There have certainly been voices within the Trump administration and Vice President Pence speaking out on this issue. What the U.S. and any administration can do, and so while we see the Vice President speaking out, I think there's potential from a different perspective to have a balanced relationship where lines of communication are continued, and U.S. government officials are raising this in meetings with Chinese officials, making sure it continues to be on the radar screen in the bilateral relationship, and monitoring conditions and raising this consistently. I think also there is the potential to influence through our supply chain management, right? This is beyond government in some ways, so that to the extent that supply chains reach into Xinjiang with labor that may not be free labor, we can make choices by U.S. corporations in managing their supply chains, and as consumers with our choices. I think Aseem also mentioned vote with your pocketbook in a sense, in terms of how you spend your money with respect to climate, also in terms of our purchases. So those are 2 to 3 ways in which I think people can, the U.S. In the U.S. can weigh in on this issue. And I think it's an element that would be reflected in both a Trump and a Biden administration. As I mentioned, we've seen the Vice President and others speak out on this issue.
Sure. So let's take one last question here, and I think I'll throw this one to both of you because it actually is kind of a crossover question. So, Professor White, you mentioned, Professor Xi, President Xi makes this big claim: we're going to be carbon neutral by 2060. And China, they're kind of building more of everything. They're building coal plants. They're also building, some renewable facilities. That they seem to be kind of placing their bets all over the place. And so this question relates to, do we have any meaningful data on whether China has actually improved its climate practices outside of COVID-related shutdowns, where there's, aerial maps and so on, where we could have some data on that. But, I think part of this question is really about how good is the data that we can get out of China on their climate practices, and can we tell what they're really doing on the climate?
Yeah, well, first, one of the issues in U.S.-China relations around the climate is that the U.S. is on a per capita basis, the biggest emitter in the world, has the biggest carbon emissions on a per capita basis, but China is the biggest emitter on a total, in total, right? So both of these countries have to step up to address this issue. China says, well, we're still developing. You guys still have higher per capita emissions. So like, take it off our agenda, take it off this bilateral agenda. That said, China has made the environment a quite high priority in context with continuing to want to develop and grow the economy. So thinking about it as starting with developing country status, even I can remember before they had catalytic converters on the cars, right? And there are a whole range of steps that the government has taken to institute clean manufacturing policies, as you mentioned, a more diverse kind of energy profile. So the Chinese government is doing a lot. At the same time, they don't want to trade that off completely with economic growth, with a large population, all of which whom aspire to the middle class. And on the data point, actually, it's just if we think about emissions, the US Embassy in the lead up to the 2008 Olympics in Beijing actually kind of threw down the gauntlet by making public its own air monitoring data from the US Embassy in Beijing. And the Chinese government responded by making public then data and building a huge program of monitoring. That data is out there. We have some very fine graduate students who are analyzing it from a number of perspectives. So data and our understanding of pollution emissions, that sort of thing in China is growing rapidly.
Great, thanks for that response. Professor Prakash, did you want to jump in on this topic?
Yeah, I think the data are very clear. So if you look at who's the leader in solar, who's the leader in wind energy, what's the salience of these two energy resources within China, which country is leading in electric vehicles? I think it's China everywhere. So whether we want to acknowledge or we don't want to acknowledge, because a lot of these companies are also multinationals. So I don't think a lot of data fudging is going on. But I think there's a bigger question that many of us don't want to ask or answer. So if there is a rise of emission in China because it's producing more steel, the issue is who's consuming the steel? Is it China or is it America and EU? Mm-hmm. And what is happening or what has happened over the last 30, 40 years is that carbon intensive industries have fled the Western world. So the Western world has become green, and they have claimed that they have broken this relationship between economic growth and CO2 emissions. But the reality has they just fudged the numbers. Because now instead of producing steel at home, we import it from China. And the problem is that IPCC and other agencies are reporting what you call territory-based emissions, which are based on production of products. In an ideal world, we would have consumption-based emissions. Is that how much emission is produced when you consume stuff? Because that is really the end point. Because if we continue to have a carbon profligate lifestyle, we may not produce those things in America. We may import them from abroad. But that really doesn't solve the climate problem. So all of us can become self-congratulatory and how green we are and how progressive we are. And we have broken this unholy link between carbon emissions and economic growth. But in reality, we have just fudged. And I think these are the kind of data questions that all of us as scholars, as citizens, as concerned individuals have to confront. And European Union has made a very strong beginning in this. They want to impose what are called border tax arrangements. So in terms of border tax, it means that if a product is manufactured abroad with a much higher carbon footprint, then it would lead to some kind of a taxes in the importing country. Of course, there are some problems with the World Trade Organization, et cetera, and there is a very large number of legal scholars, environmental scholars who are looking into this issue. But we need some kind of consumption-based carbon accounting to truly understand what our carbon footprint is.
Yeah, lots in there for us to chew on. So that's a provocative note for us to end on, let's put it that way. So I want to thank Professor Prakash and Professor Whiting for leading the presentations for today's event. I'll remind you of Weiser's Social Movements and Racial Justice event on October 7th at 11 a.m. And if you haven't received emails on that, you can find a way to register at the website of the Political Science Department at UW. And then the next installment of this series is going to be on October 14th, Will Your Vote Matter? That's going to deal with matters of polls, the potential for voting fraud, corruption, electoral irregularities, shall we say, and various things in that domain about is the votes going to be counted fairly and so on. So all those are on our agenda for the next one of these, October 14th, 6 p.m. Until then, thanks to everyone for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Good night, everybody.